Ethan Wallace was known as a brilliant, meticulous architect. His designs often became landmarks. But anyone who saw him walking down the street with a distant gaze and his briefcase perfectly aligned would never guess what had been ripped away from him without warning. At 43, Ethan carried an absence no one could see, but one that weighed on every step he took. Since the accident that claimed his wife's life, he had turned pain into routine and love into reinforced concrete. He seemed cold, distant, but inside, his soul still cried out for someone who would never return. Subscribe to the channel and be part of our story. Like, comment, and share. This helps our channel grow and motivates us to keep creating. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Across town, tucked between dusty bookshelves and stifling afternoons of reading, Clara Mitchell hid herself. A librarian by calling, a mother by miracle, she was the kind of woman who didn't draw attention at first glance. But it only took a second to sense the strength behind that tired smile. Clara lived for Hannah, her 7-year-old daughter, a girl full of questions, dreams, and laughter, but whose heart was failing. Literally. Doctors said time was short. Hannah's heart wouldn't last much longer. And yet, every day, Clara took her to school, to the library, to the park, as if time were infinite. While Ethan built towers in a desperate attempt to hold up what remained of his emotional structure, Clara fell apart with every test, every sleepless night. The universe seemed far too cruel for such a small, vibrant child. The transplant waiting list seemed endless. The prayers were often soaked in tears. And still, Clara believed. Because loving a child means believing in the impossible every single day. What neither of them knew was that somewhere between the silence of grief and the quiet cry of hope, destiny had already begun weaving its invisible threads. An accident, a hard decision, a trembling hand signing an organ donation form, Ethan's, just hours after losing everything. And then, months later, a phone call. A heart was available, a hospital, an operating room, a second chance. Hannah survived, and Ethan, somewhere, simply went on. Unaware, they were now connected, not by conscious choice, but by something deeper, something unexplainable, something profoundly human. The heart now beating inside little Hannah's chest had once belonged to Ethan's wife. But no one knew that. Not yet. Sometimes love doesn't end. It simply changes places. It changes form. Sometimes it finds new paths to keep on beating. This is the story of a silent heart that never stopped loving. A story about losses that became new beginnings. About how love can stay alive even after life is gone. And about how 3 people, destined to be lost, ended up finding one another. All because of a heart. The white walls of the hospital no longer frightened her. For Hannah, that place filled with strange smells, rhythmic beeps, and soft-voiced doctors was just part of her daily life, like going to school or playing at the park. She knew when the fatigue wasn't just laziness, when the pain in her chest wasn't just from running too much. At 7 years old, she understood her body's limits better than most adults. And still, she smiled. Always smiled. Clara, her mother, carried on her shoulders an exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Sleepless nights by her daughter's hospital bed, eyes trained on every flicker of the monitors, the anxiety of waiting for the next test. It was all part of a silent, almost sacred ritual. She lived split in two, strong on the outside, shattered within. Every irregular cough, every unusual shade on Hannah's lips felt like a warning. And worse was always possible. The doctors had been brutally honest many times. Hannah's heart was weak. The congenital condition was progressing fast. The medications now only served to delay the inevitable. At every appointment, the transplant list seemed further away, like a promised time kept unraveling. Clara listened to the statistics, the medical terms, the cold words, but all she really understood was, her daughter was dying. And yet, Hannah kept dreaming. She wanted to be an astronaut, or maybe a writer, sometimes a veterinarian. She made plans for when she would be strong again. She wanted to learn to swim, run a marathon with her mom, see snow for the first time. She spoke of these things as if writing letters to the future, without knowing if the mailman would ever deliver them. Clara, in turn, pretended to believe every plan, every wish list. Sometimes she cried in the hospital bathroom, in silence. Other times in the car, with the music turned up. But in front of her daughter, she smiled. She had learned to smile with red eyes and a heart crushed by fear. Faith was her last refuge. She prayed every night, not for a spectacular miracle, but simply for one more day. One more morning with Hannah, one more laugh, one more bedtime story, one more afternoon holding that tiny hand. The doctors had warned her. The next crisis could be fatal, and no one knew when it would come. Clara kept a bag always packed, documents in order, emergency contacts on speed dial. Every trip out of the house was planned like a military operation, but amid the chaos, she still found beauty in small things. A drawing Hannah made. A day she woke up with a little more energy. A day without pain. A flicker of hope. The school had already adapted to Hannah's needs, understanding teachers, curious and gentle classmates. But there were days she just couldn't go. She'd lie in bed, reading, drawing, waiting for something even she couldn't name. Time passed differently for those living with a heart on a countdown. And then came the hardest day, a stronger crisis, shallow breathing, blue lips, eyes blinking slowly. Clara carried her daughter in her arms to the car, ignoring the panic rising in her chest. The drive to the hospital was the longest of her life, though it only lasted 15 minutes. Hannah barely spoke. Her cold little hand squeezed her mother's with a strength that felt like an apology for not holding on any longer. In the ER, the team already knew the protocol: medications, oxygen, ICU. Clara remained by the bedside, gripping her daughter's thin fingers and whispering, "Stay with me, please stay with me." And Hannah stayed, just barely, by a miracle. It was in that moment that Clara realized just how close to the end they really were. Time could no longer be counted in months, but in days, perhaps hours. The clock now raced, cruelly, against them. And all that was left was to wait. Wait for a heart. Wait for a miracle. Wait for something, or someone she wasn't even sure existed. Ethan Wallace's home was an exact reflection of who he had become. Straight lines, neutral colors, no pictures on the walls, no sentimental objects. Everything seemed meticulously designed not to remember, not to feel. Silence ruled, broken only by the occasional pop of the heater or the soft clink of a coffee cup on a saucer. He lived alone, not just in the physical sense. Ethan had learned to live with emptiness like one lives with a scar. It's there, it hurts when touched, but over time, it becomes part of you. His wife, Margaret, was the only one who had ever broken through his defenses. She was light where he was shadow, spontaneity where he was control. She would hum while washing dishes, leave sticky notes on the fridge, make jokes that annoyed him and made him laugh. Margaret had a strange way of loving, intense, expansive, full of life. And Ethan fell in love with her for exactly that, because she filled every silence within him. But tragedy doesn't ask permission. The crash happened on an ordinary morning, at a random intersection. Margaret didn't survive. And Ethan was never the same. He didn't cry at the funeral, didn't touch her clothes, didn't move the toothbrush still resting on the sink. He simply stopped living on the inside. On the outside, he still worked, delivered projects, attended meetings. But inside, everything was frozen. Ethan never went back to the cemetery. He couldn't bear to see her name etched in stone. He preferred to believe she was somewhere else, not dead, just out of reach. There were no framed photos, no music she used to love played in the house, no books, no familiar scents, no pieces of her clothing. He got rid of everything, or almost everything. The only exception was the foundation. On the day of the accident, still at the hospital, the medical team asked about organ donation. Ethan, in shock, just nodded. He barely knew what he was signing, Days later, when the paperwork arrived, he decided to create a foundation in her name, dedicated to promoting organ donation and supporting grieving families. It was the only act he could still do in her name, a quiet way of keeping her memory alive without facing the pain head-on. But even that noble gesture was marked by distance. Ethan never attended events, never met the recipients, didn't read the monthly reports. He only signed the checks, as if by contributing, he were paying for some silent guilt he couldn't even name. Deep down, one question haunted him every night. What if it had been him instead of her? Margaret would be here now, with all the vibrant energy that defined her, slowly rebuilding life. But Ethan didn't know how to rebuild anything that wasn't made of steel and concrete. The nights were long. Their bedroom was now only his. He still slept on his side of the bed, as if expecting her to take her place. Sometimes he woke up thinking he heard her voice, a whisper, a laugh, a memory. Other times, he'd find himself staring out the window, not remembering how he got there. His grief had no screams, no visible tears. But it was no less cruel. He didn't talk about her, not with friends, not with colleagues. When someone mentioned Margaret, he'd look away, change the subject, pretend he hadn't heard. For Ethan, grief was like a house with the lights off. If you pretend you're asleep, no one knocks on the door. And so, day after day, he withdrew further. He designed buildings with mathematical precision, but couldn't build a bridge back to himself. Because part of him had been buried with her. And all that remained was this silent heart, beating out of duty, not love. Then, on a cold, gray dawn, the phone rang. Clara woke with a jolt, her heart already braced for the worst. Every late-night call carried the weight of fear, urgency, uncertainty. But this time, the voice on the other end didn't bring sorrow. It brought hope. A heart had become available. It was a match. It was real. It was now. For a moment, Clara froze. The words echoed in her mind like something from a dream. She looked at her daughter, sleeping beside her, messy hair, peaceful face, despite the weariness her body carried. Hannah, so small, so fragile, now had a chance. Not a promise, not a guess. A real chance to keep living. Hours later, already at the hospital, everything was in motion. Doctors, nurses, protocols. The team worked with precision, as if every second mattered. Clara held her daughter's hand tightly, trying to smile despite the tears that refused to stop falling. Hannah was calm. She knew something big was about to happen, and even without understanding all the details, she trusted. She always trusted her mother, the doctors, life itself. The surgery room separated them. Clara stayed outside, sitting in a stiff chair, alone in the silent hallway. Time, in that space, seemed to stop. She closed her eyes and replayed every moment of her daughter's life. Her first cry, her first steps. The first time Hannah said, "I love you." Now everything depended on a heart that came from another story, from another pain, from another loss. That same night, on the other side of the city, Ethan knew nothing. The day had been like any other for him. Meetings, emails, silence. Just another ordinary day in a routine without detours. He had no idea that in that very moment, the heart of the woman he had loved, and still loved, was beating again, in another chest, in another body, in another story. He didn't want to know where the organs went. He didn't ask. He didn't want letters. He thought it would only bring more pain, more confusion. He chose to remain distant, as if ignoring the continuity of life was a way to preserve love. But life, with its poetic irony, was already intertwining his path with the fate of the little girl now living because of Margaret. The surgery lasted for hours. Clara prayed through each one, not for guarantees, but for strength. Strength to accept whatever the outcome might be. And in the end, when the doctor emerged from the room with tired eyes but a calm expression, she collapsed. The transplant had been a success. Hannah would live. Clara entered the room while her daughter was still unconscious. That tiny body, now connected to machines, carried within it a new heart. A heart that had already loved, suffered, felt fear, courage, perhaps even hope. A heart with a story, with longing, and now, with a new mission. Clara held her daughter's hand, whispering words of gratitude to a stranger who in that moment had changed everything. She would never know the name of the woman who had saved her child, never see her face, but she would feel her presence every single day. And there, before that fragile little body, Clara swore that this gift would be honored. Hannah woke up the next day, weak, but alive. Her first sleepy smile was enough for Clara to know. Something had truly changed. There was more life in her now, more light. And without knowing, that silent heart had just found a new rhythm, a new home. And with it, the beginning of a story that would change the lives of everyone involved, even those who believed love had come to an end. Months passed since the transplant. Hannah, now stronger, seemed like a different child. Color had returned to her cheeks, her smiles came more often, and her once cautious steps had become energetic runs through the children's library. Clara watched it all with teary eyes, not from sadness, but from a silent, almost sacred joy. Every laugh from her daughter was a symphony, every breath a victory. On that particular morning, the autumn sun poured through the library windows, as if blessing the books and peaceful halls. Hannah had convinced her mother to bring her in early. She wanted to visit her favorite corner, between the shelves of fantastic tales and colorful cushions. While Clara filled out a return form, Hannah ran toward the tallest shelf, determined to grab the golden-covered book she loved. But her arms were still too short. The book fell, and that was when everything began. Ethan was just passing through, a technical visit to the community center, which happened to include the children's library he'd helped fund years earlier. He wasn't expecting to run into anyone. He was used to entering and leaving places like a shadow. Quiet, quick, unnoticed. But when he heard the sound of a book hitting the floor and saw that little girl trying to reach something bigger than herself, his instincts moved before his mind did. He bent down, picked up the book, and handed it to her with a faint smile. "That's one of the best on the shelf," he said, not expecting a reply. But Hannah looked at him in a way that threw him off. There was something there, an inexplicable recognition, as if she already knew him from somewhere she couldn't quite name. "You smell like rain," she said, smiling. "My mom says that's the smell of a good memory." Ethan stood silent for a moment. That phrase hit him in a strange way. Margaret used to say exactly that about the smell of rain. It was one of those silly little things only the two of them understood, something he thought he'd forgotten. But hearing it from the mouth of a child so naturally made him freeze. Clara arrived moments later, worried about her daughter's sudden absence. When she saw Hannah speaking with a tall man, serious-faced but kind-eyed, her protective instincts kicked in. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan stood, still a little shaken. "She just dropped a book. I helped her." The encounter was brief, almost casual, but there was something in the air that couldn't be ignored. Clara thanked him, gently took Hannah by the hand, and continued with their morning, but not without casting one last glance at that strange man who somehow felt familiar. Ethan, on the other hand, left the library feeling unsettled. That girl, there was something about her. The way she spoke, her observant eyes, the lively expression. Everything in him wanted to push that feeling away, that memory trying to resurface. But it was impossible to ignore. There was something about Hannah that touched him in a way he didn't understand. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself returning to the library, without any real reason, just to check on the space. But he always hoped to see the little girl again. And many times he did. And when he did, they talked, briefly. They discussed books, stories, small things. But the feeling grew. that strange familiarity, that warmth in his chest he thought he had forgotten. Clara noticed, too. The man who helped her daughter was now appearing often. Always polite, always kind, but with a look that carried something unspoken, something she couldn't name, but that made her pay attention. She didn't suspect anything. Not yet. It was just the beginning, a small encounter, a coincidence, a fallen book. But fate was already writing, between the lines, a story far beyond coincidence. Ethan's presence in the library became almost part of the routine. Always discreet, he arrived without drawing attention, sometimes flipping through a random book, other times just walking between the shelves. But there was a quiet purpose to his steps. He always ended up near Hannah. It was as if something invisible was pulling him toward her. A calm, unexplainable magnetism. Clara watched him, first with curiosity, then with a kind of comfort she couldn't explain. Their conversations began shyly. Comments about books, trivial questions, polite smiles. But over time the words carried more than just courtesy. Clara noticed that this man, despite his reserved nature, carried in his eyes a quiet sadness, a carefully hidden pain. And that's what made her lower her guard, because she too knew what it was like to smile with a heart still bleeding. Ethan began showing up more frequently, even on days without meetings or appointments. He said he was interested in supporting new cultural projects for the library. He suggested ideas, asked questions about the children's section. But in truth, he wanted to understand. He wanted to understand why that little girl stirred in him a feeling he believed long buried, and why her mother made his long silent heart feel something close to peace. Hannah, for her part, treated him with disarming ease. She sat beside him for story time, showed him drawings, asked difficult questions with the lightness only childhood brings. Sometimes, she'd say things that made him freeze inside. Things Margaret would say. The way she spoke, her tone. Once, while picking up a book with a floral cover, Hannah said, "It looks like the sunflower dress she used to wear, doesn't it?" Ethan didn't know who she meant, but he understood the chill that ran through him. Clara started noticing these details, the looks between them, the brief pauses Ethan made when Hannah said something unusual, and she began to wonder, who was this man really? She knew his name, his profession, and now his silences. But something about him felt loaded with a past he didn't share, a past that somehow seemed invisibly tied to her daughter. There was a day when the rain poured heavily. The library was nearly empty. Clara was packing a donation box while Hannah read near the window. Ethan walked in, soaked, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide his discomfort. He sat down, took off his coat, ran a hand through his wet hair, and stayed silent. Clara offered him coffee. He accepted. They sat at one of the side tables, and she told him about Hannah, about her battle with illness, the transplant, the months of uncertainty. Ethan listened in absolute silence. When she finished, he simply said, "She's strong. She has the heart of a warrior." The phrase lingered in the air like a premonition. After that day, something changed. His presence was no longer casual. It was expected. Hannah waited for him. Clara felt more at ease when he was around. Their conversations grew deeper. They talked about books, but also about life, about loss, new beginnings, and second chances. Ethan began to smile more. Small, reserved smiles, but genuine. Clara started to notice, and she realized that, without knowing it, she too smiled more when he was near. There was something comforting about that man, who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders, yet would bend at the laughter of a child. The bond grew silently. Neither of them spoke of feelings, but they were there, in their eyes, their gestures, the way they listened to each other, the way Ethan leaned in to hear Hannah, the way Clara allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to trust. Without realizing it, they were all healing. Three hearts, each wounded for different reasons, began to recognize each other. Not as strangers, but as part of something fate was patiently stitching together at the right time. It happened by chance, or at least, it seemed to. Clara was reorganizing old library files when she came across a forgotten folder filled with documents from reading campaigns and events sponsored by donors. One name caught her eye: Margaret Wallace Foundation, the same last name as Ethan. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. Driven by growing unease, Clara did some quick and discreet research. She discovered that Margaret Wallace had died just over a year ago in a car accident. The tragedy had been widely reported. She was the wife of Ethan Wallace, one of Boston's most respected architects. The details matched. The time, the place, everything aligned. And then, like a cold whisper in the soul, a realization began to form. Clara remembered clearly when she received the news about the heart donation. The hospital had withheld details, but now, with everything she had uncovered, with the pieces fitting together, the truth began to emerge. The heart beating inside Hannah's chest was Margaret Wallace's. The revelation hit like a sharp blow. Clara felt her breath leave her. How could she tell her own conscience, let alone the man who, in recent months, had quietly become part of her daily life? How could she explain that her daughter was alive thanks to the greatest loss of his life? How could she not feel guilty for every smile Hannah gave? For days, she kept the secret. She avoided Ethan. Her replies grew short, her gaze distant. Hannah noticed. She asked if her mother was sad. Clara only said she was tired. But the truth was different. She was at war with her soul. Guilt consumed her. Each time she saw Ethan smile at Hannah, the ground shook beneath her feet. He didn't know, and the thought of him finding out from someone else filled her with panic. But to tell him, would it destroy him again, or set him free? Clara chose to wait. She chose silence. Until the day Ethan arrived at the library holding an envelope. It was a letter he'd found among Margaret's old papers. She had written about the foundation, and how, if anything ever happened to her, she wished to donate her organs. "If a piece of me can keep living, let it be in someone who truly needs to live," the letter read. Ethan read the passage aloud, his voice filled with both pain and tenderness. Clara, hearing him, couldn't hold back. The tears came without warning. She asked him to follow her to a private room. There, her voice trembling and hard in her throat, she told him the truth. Everything. The donor's name, the connection, the hospital's silence, the recent discovery, the hesitation to tell him. Ethan was stunned. Words hung in the air. He didn't respond. He didn't meet her eyes. He simply stood, placed the envelope in his pocket, and left the room without saying a word. Clara stayed there, alone, feeling the world crumble in slow motion. She thought she had lost him forever, thought that maybe telling him had been a mistake. But she knew that silence now would be cowardice. In the days that followed, Ethan didn't return. He didn't answer messages. He didn't come to the library. Hannah asked for him every day. Clara, in silence, only said that sometimes people need time. But inside, she feared that time would turn into distance, that the truth, instead of setting them free, had become a chasm between them. The heart that once united those lives now seemed ready to tear them apart. The days following Ethan's silence felt like a harsh winter, freezing everything around. Clara felt the weight of his absence in every step, in every lost look from Hannah, who kept asking about the man who now seemed to have vanished from the world. Guilt and anguish intertwined, forming a thick fog that seemed endless. But meanwhile, Ethan had withdrawn into his own fortress of pain and memories, trying to make sense of the storm the truth had unleashed inside him. He avoided contact, declined calls, turned away. The revelation had opened a deep wound, a mix of feelings he never thought he would face: anger, confusion, fear of loving again, fear of losing again. Grief, once a static silence, had become an internal scream, raw and hard to control. It was as if past and present were at war within him, each heartbeat carrying the weight of what once was and what could have been. Until, on a gray afternoon, Ethan found himself standing before Margaret's grave. The cemetery was quiet, fallen leaves forming a soft carpet beneath his feet. He hesitated before stepping closer, feeling the cold wind brush against his face, as if the world was mourning with him. He sat before the headstone, hands trembling, eyes brimming, allowing himself, for the first time since the tragedy, to feel everything he had buried for so long. There, in the solitude of that place, Ethan spoke to Margaret. He spoke of the empty days, the silence that took over their home, the fear of moving on. He spoke of the little girl who now carried her heart, of the mother who fought for her, and of a woman who, though gone, remained a constant presence in his life. He cried softly, as if releasing years of buried pain, grief that no longer had to remain silent. And in that moment, something changed. Ethan understood that Margaret had never truly left. She was there, in every one of Hannah's smiles, in Clara's gestures, in every beat of that heart that miraculously kept going. Death wasn't an end, but a transformation, a passage that allowed love to continue in ways he had never imagined. With this new clarity, Ethan felt a lightness he hadn't known before. He stood, wiped away his tears, and walked back toward the life waiting for him beyond that cemetery. He decided it was time to live again, to accept what life was offering, no matter how complex. That love didn't have to remain trapped in the past. It could blossom in new, unexpected, and deeply meaningful ways. The next day, he sought out Clara, finding her at the library where it had all begun. She greeted him with a look filled with both hope and fear. Ethan then spoke. He apologized for his silence, for the pain it had caused. He confessed that the truth, though painful, had become a bridge instead of a wall. That despite the complexity of it all, he now saw his wife's love not as lost, but transformed. He said he wanted to try, not to rebuild something from pain, but to create something new with the promise of the future. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he was ready to find out. Clara felt the weight of his words and allowed herself to believe. Hannah smiled, not understanding everything but sensing the shift in the air. From that moment on, their bond took on new strength. Ethan not only visited the library, but became involved in its projects, engaging with Clara and Hannah more openly and sincerely. He allowed himself to laugh, to talk, to plan. The once silent heart now beat louder, filled with life and possibility. The fear didn't vanish completely. It would be unrealistic to expect that. But the courage to face the unknown, to open himself to love again, became greater than the fear. Because Ethan realized that to love is not to forget, but to carry the past with tenderness while building the present. Life, at last, regained its color. And in that small heart that now beat with a story beyond time and pain, they found the miracle they had all been waiting for, the hope of a new beginning. With a renewed heart and a lighter soul, Ethan decided it was time to transform pain into purpose. Inspired by Margaret's memory and the strength of Clara and Hannah, he envisioned a project that would unite past, present, and future. A children's library, named after his wife. A space dedicated to stories, to life, and to the love that kept pulsing in every page, in every smile. The library's opening was a moment charged with emotion. Clara, Hannah, and Ethan stood together, side by side, before that building which was more than bricks and books. It was a symbol of healing, of connection, of starting over. The walls, now bright and full of life, echoed with the laughter of children arriving to hear stories, to dream, to learn. Ethan read to Hannah and to other children seated on the soft rug, his voice growing stronger with each page turned. Clara watched, smiling, knowing that in that place, life had found a new way to bloom. The man who once hid behind silence now shared stories, embraced the present, and looked to the future with hope. Hannah, with her heart that was both miracle and symbol of love, played between the shelves, free from the illness that had once nearly taken her. She ran, laughed, jumped, and every move was a celebration of the life she had been given, a life that carried the memory of a woman she'd never meet, but who was a part of her. The bond between Ethan, Clara, and Hannah grew stronger each day, strengthened through simple gestures, honest glances, and shared moments. It wasn't a perfect love, nor a conventional family, but it was real, built on acceptance, resilience, and love that evolves and renews itself. Ethan learned to be a father through living it, discovering in his bond with Hannah a kind of love that didn't replace what he'd lost, but expanded what he could give. Clara found in Ethan a partner who was slowly leaving fear and sorrow behind to embrace what life had to offer. And Hannah, with her infectious smile, became the bridge that united two stories, two hearts, and one future. The library became a community haven, a place where stories were told, memories made, and lives intertwined. Ethan devoted himself not only as its founder, but as a constant presence, proving that love can rise from the ashes, and that even the most painful past can become the foundation for a future filled with hope. On a quiet afternoon, while reading to a group of children, Ethan looked over at Clara and Hannah. He felt a deep peace, the kind that only comes when you allow yourself to love freely, without fear or hurry, with an open heart. He knew life would never be the same, and for the first time in a long while that didn't scare him. The once silent heart, marked by loss, now beat strong, full of stories, of dreams, and of a love that transcends time and space. The family they built, unique in every way, stood as proof that life always offers second chances, even when all seems lost. And so, in Boston, among books and laughter, memories and new beginnings, Ethan, Clara, and Hannah wrote a new chapter, a chapter of healing, of love, and of hope. Because true love doesn't end, it simply finds new ways to live, beating always to the rhythm of life. So, did you enjoy this story that touches deep down in the heart? Here at Enchanting Stories, we believe every life deserves a chapter filled with hope, love, and new beginnings, just like the one we saw today. So how about becoming part of this amazing community that grows every day, full of people who love to feel and be inspired? Go ahead and click that magical little subscribe button down below. Turn on the bell so you don't miss any enchanting tales, and don't forget to leave a like. It really helps us keep bringing you stories that warm the soul. Oh, and of course, tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from? We love knowing where all this beautiful energy that follows our channel is coming from. Let's build this family of story lovers together, because here at Enchanting Stories, the next chapter could be yours too. See you next time, with more magic, emotion, and that special touch of wonder that only life can give. See you soon.